So we're going to go over how we find the least square regression on our graphing calculator. Whenever we're working with data, the first thing we should do is obviously put it into our calculator. So the area we do that, we hit the Stat button, and we want to choose option 1 for Edit. I already have my data entered. I'm going to be using height versus shoe size. If you don't have it entered, take a moment to pause the video and enter the data. I would take note that I do recommend putting your independence or your x's in L1 and your dependence in L2. Now that you have that data in your calculator, we always want to start by making a scatter plot of it to make sure that a linear model or our least squares regression line is actually appropriate. So we need to turn on our scatter plot. So I hit second and stat plot. I'm just going to use the first one. I want to make sure it's on, so I hit enter to on. The type is the one that looks like a scatter plot. And as I recommended before, I did put my x's into L1 and my dependent variables into L2. Now before I hit graph, I need to set my window, and the window is just determined by the data. The x's, or our independent variables, are height. The smallest is 62, so I'm just going to round down to 60. The biggest height is 72, so I'll round up to 75. Now the scale on the x-axis is what do I want each tick mark to measure? Well, we only have about a range of 15 inches, so I think counting by 1 inch would be plenty. The y value, or our dependent variable, is shoe sizes. So the smallest is 6.5, so I give myself a little room to see, so I'll round down to 5. The biggest shoe size is 11, so I can round that up to like 13. Now the scale on the y-axis, if we're talking about shoe sizes, it makes a little more sense to count by half sizes. Before I hit graph, I'm going to make sure I don't have any y equals or anything entered, so I'll hit graph. Now I can see that this is my data, and it does look like a line is an appropriate pattern for this. So once we recognize or agree that it's a linear model, we are going to calculate the least squares regression line. The way we do that, we are going to hit the Stat button, and we're going to go over to Calculate. Now, lin or line reg is the linear regression, and the linear regression that it chooses to do here is the least squares regression line. So we can choose option 4. Now in my option 4, I get this nice little stat wizard. If yours didn't do it, fast forward to the video when I go over through what happens if that doesn't show up. But if this does show up, we just have to refresh our calculator where we put our x's. So I put them in L1. I did put my y's in L2. We don't have a frequency list. We entered this as regular data, so you don't need to put anything for the frequency list. And I do want to store my equation so I could graph it over my scatter plot. I'm going to put that into y1. So I'm going to choose my functions or my y variables. So I hit alpha and F4, and I can choose option 1. If that doesn't work, remember you can hit the variables menu, go over to y bars, and it's in the functions menu. And then I'm going to hit calculate. This is the equation of the least squares regression, and it just tells us what the slope is and what the y-intercept is. So if I wrote it as an equation, the number before x is the a value, so 0.45. I'm just going to round that, and then the b value says it's negative 21.77. I'm going to round that to 4. So again, that is the least squares line. As I mentioned before, if you try to calculate that linear regression line and it doesn't give you that nice little menu where it asks you where your x's and your y's are, there's still an easy way to calculate it. So I've changed my calculator to make sure that it doesn't come up. So I'm still going to go to the same place. I'm going to go over to calculate, and then I'm still going to choose linear regression, or the least squares regression. But now you'll notice it doesn't give me that fancy little wizard, but the arguments are in this order. First I need to say where is my x values, so I put those into L1. Comma means the next argument. It wants to know where are the y values. I put those into L2. And the third argument is where do you want to store the equation, if so. So if you leave it blank like this, it just won't store the equation anywhere. If you want to store the equation, you put a comma and then the location of the y equals. So for me, I can hit alpha and F4 to bring up my y variable menu. Or if you can't, you would hit the variables menu, scroll over to the y variables, and the y equals is a function, and you can choose y1 right there. And it will give us the same exact line that we got before. So regardless of how we get there, what we'd want to do then is we can see that it's in our equation, and then we could look at how that fits the data. And it fits the data really well. So that's how we get our least squares line. Now when we do the least squares line, it's really, really common to analyze the correlation coefficient. Now the correlation coefficient, like for me, doesn't show up. So if I go back over here and I try to calculate my linear regression and I type in those arguments again, or if you have the wizard would come up. I'm just getting that back. It doesn't show me what the R value is. So to do that R value, we just need to turn it on. There's two easy ways to turn it on. If you have a newer model of the calculator, you can hit the Mode button. And in this menu, we will see Stat Diagnostics, and we'd want to turn that on. And that'll show us what our correlation coefficient is. If it's not there, like if you hit your Mode button and there is no Stat Diagnostic, the way that you're going to have to get to it is through the catalog. The catalog is the blue word above 0. So if I hit blue and then 0, it brings me to the catalog. Now you could just scroll down to Diagnostic On, or notice that your calculator already puts you in alpha mode. So if I want to get to the D's, I'm just going to hit the green D button. So that's right there. I'm just going to scroll down until I find Diagnostic On. And you'll notice in the mode it said Stat Diagnostic. Here it's just going to say Diagnostic On. So I'd have to click Enter and then enter one more time to confirm. Now, no matter what way that I go to get my least squares line, like I've turned my little stat wizard back on, so when I calculate my least squares line, it's going to give me that correlation coefficient. And that correlation coefficient is the R value. Since it wants us to analyze that, it's going to tell us two things, right? The strength of the relationship and the sign of that relationship. So it's positive, which means we have a positive correlation, and it's very close to 1, so it's very strong. So we could say in like one sentence, we have a strong positive correlation between your height and your shoe size. And all that positive correlation means is as our x's get bigger, our y values also get bigger. That makes sense, right? As your height gets bigger, your shoe size normally gets bigger too.